I'm going to share a little bit about my basically why I wrote Farm Lot 23 and my relationship to one particular parcel of land, which was a fruit farm in my family, um, a mixed farm really, and then a fruit farm, and then a vineyard over 100 years, and now is no longer in my family. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to read a few poems, and then we're going to have some time to write. I have a couple of writing prompts that I'll share. So ways into basically hopefully getting at some of your land relationships experiences in a kind of poetic way. We don't have to write a poem necessarily, but the prompts I give you will be something that might produce a poem, but they also might just get you into the rhythm of poetic writing. And then there'll be time to share and not necessarily share poems, but I'm certainly open to you sharing what you write here tonight. But you'll also be able to just share what the experience is like or any other stories and related to your land relationship. So the way I'm going to just lay out how I think this kind of writing fits into some of the discussions that have happened so far in the series. So I listened to Dr. Adrienne Lickers-Xavier, who spoke about Indigenous agricultural practices and Indigenous knowledge, really, and tradition, ways of knowing. And I was particularly interested in how she tied Indigenous ways of knowing to our current or maybe contemporary, but long-standing, I guess, the last couple hundred years, scientific ways of knowing. And so how much the indigenous knowledge, say, of the Three Sisters plants, the corn, beans, squash growing together in a symbiotic relationship, was then verified by science for how basically how productive and mutually protective and sustaining that arrangement of those plants growing together was, and how indigenous communities had come up with that without science, through observation, through practice, through experimentation. So that being alerted to kind of the richness and wisdom and ways of knowing that come from paying attention, which we know is one of the ways we understand science. It's a way of paying attention. And now it involves paying attention with technology. Um, and there are interesting things we can talk about there because technology is also a way of removing our bodies from a place. So we pay attention differently and we collect information and store it and arrange it differently. But there's a tremendous amount of things that Indigenous communities knew that we know again in different ways, and things that we've forgotten or lost through trying to come at knowledge in a different way as well. And then I listened to Hugh Fraser talk about the advancement of technology over the last 50 years, which was wild. I learned crazy things like we can grow a chicken in 35 days. And that he talked about how much the phone has changed farming. So, how much is monitored through the phone, but also communication and the way that data can be received in such a mobile way. Uh, so that's pretty fascinating. And I thought a lot about that opportunity of productivity and how we can grow so much food for so many people. But it also left me with the question of what is our relationship to land when we are focused on productivity, and that idea of it being more of a medium instead of a place. And the ways of knowing become massive amounts of data that we're collecting, which also still has to be interpreted and sifted through. And how do we interpret that in generations down the road when there haven't been people who have been living intimately with the land and farming in other ways? So it raised all sorts of questions like that for me. And so then I think of this other way of knowing, which is personal. And poetry, I would say, is a personal way of knowing and communicating. And it's something that gets shared with the community, but it's something that's very much done alone and tends to tap into and value individual experiences, um, which we'll dip into later with you. Um, And I'm just going to read this quote from Seamus Heaney, and he's a late, great Irish poet who wrote a lot about land, Nobel Prize winning poet, but who wrote very accessible, very down to earth poetry. And this is what he says about basically individual knowledge and the value of it. The true and durable path into and through experience involves being true to the actual givens of your lives, true to your own solitude, true to your own secret knowledge. Because, oddly enough, it is that intimate, deeply personal knowledge that links us most vitally and keeps us most reliably connected to one another. So I love how that way of knowing can fit into all these other ways. It's not about, relying on one. It's about valuing all of these different ways of knowing, I think, the land and being on it and growing things, and how those ways of knowing can be in relationship with one another. And I think we get into trouble when we give one all of the authority. Um, and we, I think, have that experience in many ways. Um, so the poetry book I wrote is called Farm Lot 23. And after we sold our farm, and we sold it to initially to people who had a very different relationship to it than we did. And I felt in a huge amount of loss. Um, and, it wasn't my decision to sell it. I didn't own it. My parents owned it. I owned part of a wine company that was on it, but um, being able to write the book was a wonderful way of going back and appreciating that land, and not everything about it and everything we did on it was wonderful. So I write about the complications and tensions and the things that I found in contradiction, or that didn't hadn't been sitting right with me while we were there. And some of those things are just big cultural things, like, we cut out these little parcels of land, but they belong to water systems and big living systems in and of themselves. And so there's always a challenge with all of when you grow things and to be successful, productive on one piece of land, it's often at the cost of other lives, other kinds of plants, other animals, their habitats. And when we were farming, we eventually were moving more toward, we'll call it organic and biodynamic farming, but it was still monoculture. And monoculture has its stresses on the land, and that creates also huge stresses in people. Um, so I wanted to pay attention to all of the relationships, not just kind of what we were growing. And then, of course, that got me curious about my family history. and what it was like for my ancestors living on the land. And it was a lot harder for them than it was for me. I had a pretty cushy existence there in comparison. But I got to ask my dad, who's still living, those questions about his father and grandfather. And so a lot of the work is based on that. There's also quite a bit of attention giving to migrant workers and the complexity and problems, the trouble with the Migrant Workers Act and the limitations basically for being paid just enough for people to want to return to work, but not enough to um, to change their lives for the better, really. So it's a bit of a trap of a system for migrant workers. And so there's that in there. There's also my love for the place and people who I knew at that time. And I think it all belongs. It's not one thing or the other. I think another job of a poet is to try and hold it all in a loving way. Um, the difficulty and the beauty, and try and do it without a lot of judgment, just attention. So I hope I did that. Um, so I'll start with a couple of poems that speak to the history, and I'm not going to read a ton. I'll read a few. I find it, I attend poetry readings too, and I find that we need to be kind to our listeners because hearing a lot of poetry, because poetry is a bit dense. It's not done necessarily normally the way we speak. It can be hard on the ear, so I like to give a lot of space around that. But I'll introduce you to my grandparents who lived on the farm, and and I think I'll just let the poems speak for themselves. But this would have been in the 40s and 50s. My grandfather Bill. My grandfather Bill raised apples, houses, sheds, asparagus, wheat, peaches, two daughters, one son, chickens, barns, raspberries, cows, pears, goat, cherries. He planted trees, not in rows, Chinese chestnut, black walnut, silver maple, Scots pine, cedar. By the time I knew him, he built chessboards, light squares in ash, dark in mahogany, and coffee tables, boxes. He collected galena embedded with semi-precious stones, had trouble breathing from emphysema. Amethyst octahedron columns shone, quartz sparkled on the wood shelves he made in his basement at the bottom of the stairs, he'd sawed, then nailed together. I couldn't square what I knew of him with the stories my parents told. All the bad business decisions he'd taken that landed the family poorer. My grandmother saying Bill could bring in the farm, but he couldn't sell it. My dad saying his dad had searched for gold near Durham on 160 acres he'd bought by selling off the northeast corner of the farm for less than he might have. I knew him away from the farm. When we visited in town, he would place his right palm into my 8-year-old left one, lift the back of my hand to his mouth, hold it there, his lips a wet tissue, his breathing wheezy, his hand cold and bony, like stone, like wood, like a box, like the gold he never struck. So the other thing I'll say about poetry is it tends to invite us into the sensuality of it experience, the people, place. So um, that's part of our relationship to land, to time, to memory, is what we remember smelling, tasting, touching, hearing. Um, so just to think about that as we before we get into our writing exercise as well. So to balance this with my grandmother Nora, who lived on the farm as well. My grandmother Nora set her hips to the cement kitchen floor in the basement in the house my grandfather built, piecemeal, where she peeled potatoes, carrots, boiled water, gutted chickens. A galvanized basin stood by, a a bathtub full, with nobody in it. Gray water ripening in the heat in harmony with the slop pail. What later weighed on her hips, I blamed on her sitting watching Wheel of Fortune, The Price is Right. A daytime habit she adopted late in life after each hip replacement, walking little, not letting go of her canes until her recovery included them. Nora was one hell of a badminton player. I knew her in her garlic paper skin, spiced in cosmetic dust, her voice faint and powdered too. Had she soft spoken to my grandfather, to his farm frustrations, to their losses, to their daughter's relentless mental illness, hush, 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 soft, soft. Nora managed the hired help on the farm while Bill busied himself in the shed. I didn't know my grandmother on the farm. I knew her in the chair in town, the one my grandfather vacated, the TV athrob across the blue carpet, antenna needling for reception, the Niagara River mouth pouring out the window, emptying into the Great Lake Ontario basin. Okay, I'm going to read a poem that gets a little bit to the relationship to measuring. And I can definitely say we were even in the 2000s a pretty low tech farm. Um, the give in inches. After my dad numbers each end post with white paint, we find ourselves by a landmark. It's out by the oak tree. Go about halfway, look for Errol's bike. Just past the hymrod, the first row in the old Chardonnay. When we ditch the short ton for tones, my dad intones the metric O as if to add the extra pounds. Remind us it means more. At the butcher counter, my mom orders about ham, about half pound, no discussion, no fuss. She gives and takes hours on the farm payroll in a spiral notebook. Earth shifts, settles, resettles. The old weigh scale needle sticks. Row numbers fade. Rain never falls evenly over acres, nor does the soil take up wet the same all over. Content varies in strata, wildly in swaths, in veins northwest, east, south, east, west, north, south. Heel toe, heel toe, heel toe, heel toe, my dad counts the ground for fence posts. His foot measures more than a foot in work boots. My parents sum up the farm in 20 acres. The survey says 18.5. They never do agree on boundaries. A bushel shrinks or swells depending on who's picking, the person paid piecework, the pick your own picker, the proud seller, my mother. My dad shows me the space an inch makes with his thick index finger and meaty work thumb. It takes years for me to learn the flesh doesn't belong to the inch. Okay, I think I will just read one more. And this is about the farm's relationship to water. And there was always too much or never enough. And it's such a, I think, classic story of farming, that experience of depending on the weather. So it's just called water. We leave the hose in the raspberry patch to run all night. Today we'll place sweat lines at the feet of young Riesling. Nailed to a post, the cracked rain gauge clouds over in baked residue. I'm early to the clothesline to hang the dripping sheets. On a neighbor's farm, the Niagara River gushes over peaches 24/7. The pumped out river breaches the property line, pools, makes muck. It rains in pissy amounts around us, never on our farm. My parents soak through their shirts, talk about the forecast. The vines, the garden, the trees need nothing fewer than inches. If they were to get two, they should have gotten three or four, and so on. I wake up to my mother dragging hoses around the yard. Promise inflates the horizon in cumulonimbus. Hail threatens in purple shades. All the plants transpire, send moisture the wrong way. But soon enough the fall will come, and nobody wants fall rain. God forbid. That could ruin everything. So yeah, that's just a little taste. It's hard to cover all the relationships in a few poems, but just to say, I spend a lot of time with all of the different trees that we didn't grow on the farm as well, and as well as the machinery and various characters that I met when we lived there. So I'd love to just introduce the writing exercise so that we can involve you all a little bit here. I'm going to take some water. I'm going to give you three different options, and then we'll have a good chunk of time just to sit here and do some writing quietly together. So the first option, and I can review these, is based on a poet called Gregory Orr, and this is a fantastic book if you're interested in writing poems. It's a primer for poets and readers of poetry. And it's just a really interesting book from a poet who's been basically living poetry, teaching it and writing it for his whole life, so 40 or 50 years. But one of the exercises, and it's more just to kind of loosen things up so you can get at the material that's in you, is to basically write the words I remember with a place in mind and see what comes after. and just keep doing it. I remember, I remember, I remember. One of the things that that does is basically get you into a rhythm that can free up your body to just respond and say what it knows. And also you start, it's a very pleasing sound when you read it and you get to appreciate what repetition does in poetry. There are lots of poems that do that. They start with the same first few words, and then the excitement and the surprises and the variation after. So you get the steadiness of that lovely rhythm, and then you get the surprise at the end of that phrase in each line. So that's something you could do if that sounds interesting or fruitful to you. That's great. And they can be super simple things or more involved things. I mean, it can be as simple as remembering the taste of an apple off a tree, the smell of wildflowers in a field, but it could be the smell of diesel. It could be anything. It doesn't have to be also pretty. Poetry never has to be pretty. So that's one option. Another is to take on the voice of something. So you can speak as a whole place, a field, a tree. Um, I did this recently at a workshop, and I spoke as a carrot. I just chose to speak as a carrot, and I was surprised. It was actually kind of an intense poem. Because I started to think about the way it would feel to be pulled out of the earth so violently at the end. But also the amazing thing of how a carrot takes all of that sweetness into the ground. So yeah, but you could take on the voice of it could be a farm implement as well. It could be anything that comes to mind that you think would be fun. It could be funny, fun, interesting, sad, all of the above, but just to try and imagine speaking as something else. And the other, which is a little bit similar maybe, but it would be from your voice. And I was thinking either of a letter or a postcard that you would want to write to a place or a, it could be a whole place, it could be a farm, it could be a period of time. Um, it could be a farm implement. It could be, doesn't have to have anything to do with the farm. It could be a tree or a rose bush, whatever. But you would be writing to that. Um, maybe you miss that being, that entity, or maybe it taught you something. So those are three options for the I remember exercise. I remember and just letting that run. Um, you could take the voice of something not human, I should specify. And then writing a letter or a postcard to a place or something living on that place. And just before, I wanted to read this beautiful quotation I found. And this is also an amazing book and relevant to what we're talking about. Is a River Alive by Robert McFarlane. And yeah, it's really about what happens, how we treat landscapes and rivers when we don't imagine that they're alive, and how there's a whole movement of people now um, who are beginning to change the language around rivers and living systems, even to the point of calling them who rather than an it. So that's pretty interesting. Um, but just on that subject of how we imagine something changes the way we relate to it and the way we treat it. this is a quotation in here. One way to stop seeing trees or rivers or hills only as natural resource is to class them as fellow beings, kinfolk. I guess I'm trying to subjectify the universe because look where objectifying it has gotten us. To subjectify is not necessarily to co-opt, colonize, exploit. Rather, it may involve a great reach outward of the mind and imagination. So that's what I was thinking a little bit when I was imagining taking on the voice of something else too. It's just imagining outside the human experience a little bit. So this is always an experiment, and I hope that you're open to it. And again, there's no requirement for sharing, so please feel free to write and enjoy the writing process. And then what you choose to share, or if you choose to share, is entirely up to you. Um, so we'll give ourselves, I think, 20 minutes would be great, and then we'll come back and talk or share about that. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, Tonya. Well, all
You're
right,
welcome.
I'm gonna leave the meeting on, but people can mute, and then
Okay,
when you're ready for us all to come back, if you just wanna give a
perfect.
shout, we'll come back, and those who want to share will share. I'm looking forward to trying some of these prompts, so thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. And I'll set the timer. Okay, thanks.